Before we dive into one of the most horrifying massacres in American history, I need you to do something critical right now. Hit that subscribe button. Why? Because this channel uncovers the darkest, most forgotten true crime stories that history tried to bury, and if you're not subscribed, you'll miss the next investigation. Take 3 seconds, click subscribe, turn on the bell. Do it now, because what you're about to hear will make your blood run cold, and you'll want to be here for every twisted case we cover. Done? Perfect. Let's begin. Picture this. A quiet summer evening in rural Alabama, 1884. The cotton fields stretch endlessly under a blazing sun. Cicadas drone in the heat. Farmers finish their work, wipe the sweat from their brows, and head home to their families. It's just another day in Sumter County, where everyone knows everyone, and life moves at the slow, predictable pace of the agricultural South. Then, in the span of 48 hours, 14 men are brutally murdered. Their bodies are found in fields, in their homes on dirt roads. Some are shot. Others are beaten to death. A few are mutilated beyond recognition. The killers. 3 brothers who decided that a burned cotton shed was worth more than human life. This is the story of the Boone brothers, and the bloodbath that turned Alabama into a hunting ground. The Boone family. To understand how 3 men could commit such unspeakable acts, we need to understand where they came from. The Boone family wasn't wealthy. They weren't powerful. They were dirt farmers scratching out a living in one of the poorest counties in Alabama, just 2 decades after the Civil War had torn the South apart. William Boone, the family patriarch, owned a modest plot of land near the town of Livingston. He had 7 children, but 3 of his sons would become the architects of terror. Thomas, the eldest at 32, was known as a hot-tempered man who settled disputes with his fists. Andrew, 28, was quieter but more calculating, the kind of man who nursed grudges for years. And Samuel, the youngest at 24, was loyal to his brothers above all else, even above the law. The Boones weren't troublemakers, not really. They had occasional disputes with neighbors over property lines and stray livestock, the kind of petty conflicts that plague rural communities everywhere. But nothing that suggested the capacity for mass murder, nothing that would make you look at them twice if you passed them on the street. That all changed in the summer of 1884. The Cotton Shed. June 15th, 1884. The Boone brothers discovered that their cotton storage shed had burned to the ground during the night. Inside had been approximately 2,000 pounds of raw cotton, ready to be taken to market. In today's money, that represents a loss of several $1,000s, but in 1884, for a struggling farm family, it was devastating. It was their entire season's work, their income for the year, perhaps their survival. The shed hadn't burned by accident. The fire had been deliberately set. Someone had poured kerosene around the base and struck a match. The Boones found evidence, boot prints in the dirt, a discarded kerosene tin hidden in nearby bushes, and something else. A piece of torn fabric that Thomas Boone swore he recognized. The fabric, he claimed, came from a shirt worn by a man named Jacob Miller. Now, Jacob Miller was a neighboring farmer who'd had a running dispute with the Boones over water rights. A creek ran between their properties, and both families needed that water for their crops. The Boones accused Miller of damming the creek upstream, reducing their water supply. Miller accused the Boones of letting their cattle foul the water. It was the kind of argument that had been simmering for months, never quite boiling over, but never quite resolving either. Thomas Boone took that scrap of fabric to his brothers and said 4 words that would seal 14 men's fates. Miller's going to pay. The first killing. What the Boone brothers should have done was obvious. Take their evidence to the sheriff. File a complaint. Let the law handle it. But in Sumter County in 1884, the law was a distant, unreliable thing. The sheriff's office was understaffed and overwhelmed. Court dates were months away, and the Boones had already decided that they knew who was guilty. On the evening of June 17th, Thomas and Andrew Boone rode to Jacob Miller's farm. Samuel stayed behind, supposedly to establish an alibi, though he knew exactly what his brothers intended to do. Miller was in his barn, tending to his horses, when the Boones arrived. Witnesses later testified that they heard shouting, then 3 gunshots. When Miller's wife ran to the barn, she found her husband dead on the ground, shot twice in the chest and once in the head. Thomas and Andrew Boone were riding away across the fields. This was the moment when the Boone brothers could have stopped. They'd gotten their revenge. They'd killed the man they believed had destroyed their livelihood. They could have fled Alabama, disappeared into the vastness of America, and perhaps escaped justice. Many men did exactly that in those days, but the Boones didn't run. They went home. And when the sun rose the next morning, they made a decision that transformed them from murderers into monsters. They decided that anyone who might testify against them had to die. The mathematics of murder. Think about what the Boone brothers were calculating. Jacob Miller had a family, a wife, 2 adult sons, a brother who lived nearby. Miller had farmhands who worked his property. He had friends who would have seen the Boones arguing with him in the weeks before his death. Each of those people represented a potential witness. Each of them could stand in a courtroom and point at Thomas and Andrew Boone and say, "They did it." In the twisted logic of men who had already crossed the line into murder, the solution was simple: eliminate the witnesses. All of them. On the morning of June 18th, Samuel Boone joined his brothers. The 3 of them armed themselves with rifles, pistols, and knives. They saddled their horses, and they began a killing spree that would last 3 days. Their first targets were Miller's 2 sons, James and Robert. The brothers found them working in a cotton field about a mile from the Miller homestead. There was no conversation, no warning. Thomas Boone simply raised his rifle and shot James Miller in the back. Robert tried to run, made it perhaps 20 yards before Andrew's bullet caught him in the leg. Samuel finished him with a knife. The Millers' bodies were left where they fell. The Boones didn't try to hide their crimes. They were beyond that now. They were operating on a pure, brutal calculus: kill everyone who could hurt them and kill them fast before word could spread. But word was already spreading. The panicked news traveled slowly in rural Alabama, but it traveled. By noon on June 18th, people knew that Jacob Miller was dead. By evening, they knew his sons were dead too. And the farmers of Sumter County began to realize something terrifying. If the Boones were willing to kill 3 members of the Miller family, they might kill anyone who could connect them to the crimes. Several men decided to ride to Livingston to fetch the sheriff. Their names were William Garrett, Henry Thompson, and Charles Wade. They were friends of the Miller family, and they'd seen Thomas Boone arguing with Jacob Miller just days before the fire. They were witnesses, and the Boone brothers knew it. The 3 men never made it to Livingston. Their bodies were found the next morning on the road, approximately 5 miles from town. All 3 had been shot multiple times. Garrett had been dragged off his horse and beaten so severely that his face was unrecognizable. Thompson had been shot in the back while apparently trying to flee. Wade had made it the farthest. He'd been found with his pistol drawn, suggesting he'd at least tried to fight back, but he'd been outnumbered and outgunned. This is when the true horror of the situation became clear. The Boone brothers weren't just killing to cover up a single murder. They were killing anyone who might pose a threat. And in a small rural county where everyone knew everyone else's business, that meant a lot of potential targets. The sheriff finally got word late on June 19th. His name was Marcus Coleman, and by all accounts he was a decent lawman, but he was completely unprepared for what he was riding into. Coleman deputized 6 men and rode hard for the Boone property, intending to arrest the brothers before anyone else died. He was too late. The widening circle. While Sheriff Coleman was gathering his posse, the Boone brothers were expanding their killing. They'd made a list, either written or simply understood among themselves, of everyone who might pose a danger. That list included Jacob Miller's brother Daniel Miller, who lived on an adjacent property. The Boones found him at home with his wife and 3 children. They shot Daniel on his front porch. Incredibly, horrifyingly, they left his family alive. Perhaps they calculated that a widow and young children wouldn't be believed in court, or perhaps even the Boones had some limit to their depravity. We'll never know. 2 farmhands who worked for the Millers, a man named Joseph Reed and his teenage son, also named Joseph. The Reeds were African American, and in the racial dynamics of 1884 Alabama, the Boones likely assumed their testimony wouldn't matter in court. But they killed them anyway, possibly just to be thorough, or possibly because racial hatred made it easier to pull the trigger. A merchant from Livingston named Samuel Pritchard, who'd had business dealings with Jacob Miller, and had been heard saying he'd seen the Boone brothers near Miller's property on the night of the fire. Pritchard was shot while closing his store for the evening. His body was discovered by his wife when she came to walk him home for dinner. A farmer named George Hawkins, whose only crime was living near the Miller property, and thus potentially seeing something. Hawkins was killed while working in his field. His murder was particularly brutal. Evidence suggested he'd been tortured before being shot, possibly because the Boones wanted to know what he'd seen or who he'd told. By the evening of June 19th, the death toll stood at 13. 13 men dead in 3 days, and the Boone brothers showed no signs of stopping. The sheriff's posse, Sheriff Coleman and his 6 deputies, reached the Boone property just after sunset on June 19th. What they found was eerie. The farmhouse was lit up, smoke rising from the chimney as though it were just another ordinary evening. Coleman later testified that he could smell food cooking, could hear voices inside talking and even laughing. The Boones knew the law was coming. They had to know. But they were eating dinner. Coleman called out for the Boones to surrender. The response was immediate and violent. Gunfire erupted from the windows of the farmhouse. One deputy, a man named Frank Morrison, was killed instantly, shot through the throat. Another deputy was wounded in the shoulder. The remaining posse members took cover behind trees and a stone well, and a firefight ensued. This is where the story takes a turn into something almost mythological. According to multiple testimonies, the Boone brothers held off the sheriff's posse for more than 2 hours. They had superior positions, firing from windows and from behind the thick walls of their farmhouse. They had stockpiled ammunition, and they were fighting with the desperate fury of men who knew they had nothing left to lose. Sheriff Coleman sent a deputy back to Livingston for reinforcements. But before help could arrive, something unexpected happened. The farmhouse caught fire. To this day, no one knows exactly how it started. Some accounts claim that Coleman ordered his men to throw lit torches onto the roof. Others suggest that a stray bullet hit a kerosene lamp inside. A few witnesses swore that they saw Thomas Boone himself deliberately set the fire, choosing to burn rather than surrender. Whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. Flames consumed the old wooden structure with terrifying speed. The gunfire from inside became more sporadic, then stopped altogether. Coleman and his men waited, guns trained on the doors and windows, expecting the Boones to flee the inferno. But no one came out. When the fire finally burned itself out in the early hours of June 20th, Coleman and his deputies searched the ruins. They found 3 bodies charred beyond recognition, but presumed to be the Boone brothers based on their size and location. Thomas was near the back door, as though he'd been trying to escape at the last moment. Andrew was in what had been the main room, collapsed near a rifle. Samuel was upstairs in a bedroom, curled in a corner. The Alabama bloodbath was over. 14 men were dead, 13 victims and 1 deputy. The 3 killers had died by fire, whether by accident or by choice. But the story doesn't end there. The aftermath. The Boone killing sent shockwaves through Alabama and beyond. Newspapers across the South covered the story, with lurid headlines describing the Cotton Shed Massacre and the Alabama Reign of Terror. The incident became a grim symbol of the lawlessness that still plagued parts of the post-Civil War South, where vendettas could spiral out of control and where the machinery of justice was too slow and too weak to stop men bent on violence. But here's where the story gets complicated, because there were questions. Lots of questions. First, were the Boones actually guilty of burning the cotton shed? No trial ever established this. The scrap of fabric that Thomas claimed came from Jacob Miller's shirt was never forensically examined. It's entirely possible that the Boones murdered an innocent man based on circumstantial evidence, then killed 13 more people to cover up that first unjust killing. Second, did the Boones really kill all 13 victims attributed to them? Sheriff Coleman certainly believed so, but remember, this was 1884. There was no CSI, no ballistics testing, no DNA evidence. Several of the murders happened in remote locations with no witnesses. It's possible that in the chaos and panic, other killings were attributed to the Boones simply because they were convenient scapegoats. Some historians have suggested that as few as 8 or 9 of the deaths can be definitively linked to the brothers. Third, what happened to the Boone family fortune? This is perhaps the strangest question of all. After the fire, when authorities inventoried the Boone property, they found something shocking. Hidden in the barn, buried in the floor, was a steel box containing more than $8,000 in gold coins. In 1884 terms, this was a massive fortune, far more than a struggling cotton farm could have generated. Where did it come from? The Boones had no known criminal history before the massacre. No evidence of robbery or theft. The money remains unexplained to this day. Some theorists have suggested that the Boone brothers were involved in something much larger than a simple revenge killing. Perhaps they were part of a criminal gang. Perhaps they'd stolen the gold and the cotton shed fire was related to that theft somehow. Perhaps the massacre wasn't about covering up one murder, but about silencing witnesses to something else entirely. We'll probably never know the truth. The victims. In all the sensationalism surrounding the Boone brothers, it's easy to forget the victims. So let's take a moment to remember them, because these weren't just statistics. They were human beings with families, with dreams, with lives that were cut short by violence. Jacob Miller was 43 years old. He had a wife, Sarah, and 2 sons. He'd fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, been wounded at Shiloh, and came home to build a life as a farmer. His neighbors described him as hard-working and fair-minded. His widow never remarried. She lived on the farm alone for another 30 years until her death in 1914. James and Robert Miller, Jacob's sons, were 22 and 19 respectively. James had been engaged to be married that fall. Robert had dreams of becoming a schoolteacher. Both were described as kind young men who helped their neighbors and attended church every Sunday. William Garrett, Henry Thompson, and Charles Wade, the 3 men killed while riding to fetch the sheriff, were all family men. Garrett left behind a wife and 4 children. Thompson had 6 children, the youngest just 3 months old. Wade was a widower raising his 2 daughters alone. Daniel Miller, Jacob's brother, was 50 years old and had been planning to move to Texas to start a new farm. His wife was so traumatized by witnessing his murder that she lost her ability to speak. Medical records from the time describe it as shock-induced mutism. She never spoke another word for the remaining 12 years of her life. Joseph Reed and his son, the farmhands, were forgotten by history almost immediately. Contemporary newspaper accounts mentioned them only in passing, and several papers didn't even record their names. This was the ugly reality of racial inequality in the post-Civil War South. Even in death, black victims were rendered invisible. Samuel Pritchard, the merchant, was 62 years old and had been planning to retire. He'd already hired a young man to take over his store and was looking forward to spending time with his grandchildren. George Hawkins, the farmer who was tortured before being killed, left behind a wife and 7 children. His farm was sold at auction to pay his debts. His family was left destitute. Frank Morrison, the deputy killed during the shootout at the Boone farmhouse, was 28 years old. He'd been a lawman for less than a year. His wife was pregnant with their first child when he died. She gave birth to a son 3 months later and named him Frank Jr., in honor of his father. These were the people the Boone brothers killed. Not abstractions, not numbers. People. The trial that never was because the Boone brothers died in the fire, there was never a trial. This meant that officially, legally, they were never convicted of the murders. Some family members of the Boones insisted for years that the brothers had been innocent, that they'd been framed or railroaded by a corrupt sheriff's department looking for easy scapegoats. These claims seem far-fetched given the evidence, but they reveal something important about the nature of justice and closure. Without a trial, without the opportunity for the accused to defend themselves or for witnesses to testify under oath, there's always room for doubt, always room for conspiracy theories and alternative narratives. The state of Alabama conducted an official inquiry into the killings in 1885. The report, which still exists in the state archives, concluded that the Boone brothers were responsible for at least 11 of the 14 deaths, including the murder of Jacob Miller and the subsequent killing of witnesses. The report acknowledged uncertainty about the remaining 3 deaths, but noted that the evidence was consistent with the Boone's guilt. Interestingly, the report also addressed the mysterious gold found on the Boone property. Investigators interviewed neighbors, examined records, and tried to trace the money's origins. They found nothing. No evidence of theft, no unexplained income, no criminal enterprise. The gold remains one of the great mysteries of the case. The report's final conclusion was telling. The Boone brothers, whether guilty of all crimes attributed to them, or merely some, engaged in a campaign of violence that terrorized Sumter County and resulted in a tragic loss of life. Their deaths by fire, while preventing a legal resolution, have at least ended the immediate threat to public safety. It was closure of a sort, but not the kind that brings real peace. The legacy. The Alabama bloodbath faded from public memory surprisingly quickly. Within a decade, it was rarely mentioned even in local histories. By the 1920s, it had become the sort of story that old-timers told on front porches, half-remembered and embellished with each retelling. By the 1950s, it had been almost completely forgotten. Why? How does a massacre of this magnitude disappear from collective memory? Part of the answer is simply the passage of time. The people who remembered it firsthand died. Their children grew up, moved away, started new lives. The South was changing, modernizing, trying to put the violent chaos of the post-Civil War era behind it. But part of the answer is also more troubling. Stories like the Boone killings didn't fit the narrative that the South wanted to tell about itself. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw the rise of the lost cause mythology, which romanticized the Old South and downplayed the violence and lawlessness of the Reconstruction era. A story about 3 white farmers massacring their neighbors over a petty dispute didn't fit that romantic vision, so it was forgotten. Deliberately or not, the story was allowed to fade. Today, there's almost nothing left to mark the events of June 1884. The Boone farmhouse, of course, is long gone, burned to the ground. The Miller property was eventually sold and subdivided. Most of the victims are buried in small country cemeteries, their headstones weathered and hard to read. There is one small memorial in Livingston, erected in 1984 on the centennial of the killings. It's a simple granite marker that lists the names of the victims and includes the inscription, "In memory of those who died in the Sumter County tragedy of 1884. May we learn from the past and choose peace over vengeance. It's visited rarely. Most people in Sumter County today have never heard of the Boone brothers or the Alabama bloodbath. Questions that remain. Even now, more than 140 years later, there are aspects of this case that remain mysterious and troubling. The most obvious question: what really happened to the cotton shed? Was it actually Jacob Miller who burned it? The evidence against him was thin, a scrap of fabric that may or may not have come from his shirt. No witnesses saw him near the Boone property that night. No one heard him confess or threaten the Boones. It's entirely possible that the fire was an accident, or that it was set by someone else entirely, perhaps even by the Boones themselves, to collect on an insurance policy or to justify violence they'd already planned. Then there's the question of the gold. $8,000 in 1884 would be worth well over $200,000 today. Where did it come from? The investigative report found no evidence of criminal activity, but the Boone farm's legitimate income couldn't possibly have generated that much wealth. Some historians have speculated that the Boones were involved in smuggling or counterfeiting, but there's no proof. Others suggest the gold might have been buried by someone else, perhaps even by Union or Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, and the Boones simply found it. Again, no proof. And then there's the darkest question of all. How many people did the Boone brothers actually kill? The official count is 13 victims plus 1 deputy. But in the chaos of those 3 days, were there other deaths that went unrecorded? Were there people who disappeared, whose bodies were never found, whose families assumed they'd simply run away? We know that several people fled Sumter County during the killings, abandoning their homes in terror. Most eventually returned, but some never did. Were they simply too frightened to come back? Or did they meet a darker fate? There's no way to know for certain. The psychology of mass murder. Modern criminologists and psychologists have studied the Boone case, trying to understand what transforms ordinary people into killers capable of such extreme violence. What they've found is disturbing. The Boone brothers weren't psychopaths in the clinical sense. By all accounts, they'd lived relatively normal lives before the massacre. They had friends, families, social connections. Thomas Boone was even described as charismatic by some who knew him. What seems to have happened is a phenomenon that psychologists call violence escalation, or snowball violence. The brothers committed one murder, arguably in a fit of rage over the destroyed cotton. But once they'd crossed that line, once they'd killed Jacob Miller, they entered a new psychological space where moral constraints began to dissolve. Each subsequent killing became easier, not harder. The first murder creates enormous psychological stress, but humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. We can normalize almost anything if we're exposed to it repeatedly. By the time the Boones were killing their 8th or 9th victim, they were likely operating almost on autopilot, viewing their victims not as people, but as problems to be eliminated. There's also the group dynamic to consider. The three brothers reinforced each other's violence. If any one of them had been acting alone, they might have stopped after the first killing. But together, they created an echo chamber of rage and justification. Each brother's willingness to kill made it easier for the others to kill. They were bound together by blood and by their crimes, unable to back down without betraying each other. This is a pattern we see in other mass killings and genocides throughout history. Ordinary people, placed in extraordinary circumstances and operating in groups, can commit acts of shocking brutality. The Boone brothers were monsters, but they were human monsters, and that's perhaps the most frightening thing of all. Comparisons to other cases. The Alabama bloodbath wasn't the only mass killing in American history, of course, but it was unusual in several respects. Most mass murders are committed by lone individuals, often motivated by psychosis, ideology, or a desire for notoriety. The Boone killings were different. They were collaborative, methodical, and driven by a coldly rational, if utterly immoral goal: the elimination of witnesses. The closest parallel might be to organized crime hits where multiple victims are killed to prevent testimony. But the Boones weren't professional criminals. They were farmers who improvised a killing spree with terrifying efficiency. Some historians have compared the Boone case to the Bender family murders in Kansas, which occurred about a decade earlier. The Benders ran an inn where they murdered guests for their money, eventually killing at least 11 people before fleeing. But the Benders were motivated by greed and operated over a period of years. The Boones killed in a compressed time frame of 3 days, motivated by a twisted sense of self-preservation. Perhaps the most apt comparison is to feuds like the famous Hatfield-McCoy conflict, which also took place in the post-Civil War South and involved multiple killings over perceived slights and property disputes. But even the Hatfield-McCoy feud, which lasted for decades, resulted in fewer deaths than the Boone brothers caused in 3 days. The Alabama bloodbath stands alone in American criminal history as one of the most concentrated, brutal acts of violence committed by civilians against their own community. If they had survived. It's worth considering what would have happened if the Boone brothers had survived the fire and been brought to trial. In 1884, Alabama, there was still capital punishment by hanging. Given the magnitude of their crimes and the public outrage, there's little doubt that all three brothers would have been convicted and sentenced to death. The trial would have been a sensation, drawing spectators from across the South. But there's also a possibility, however remote, that the Boones might have escaped the noose through legal technicalities or political connections. Remember, this was an era when justice was often arbitrary and inconsistent, especially in rural areas. Wealthy defendants could hire good lawyers. Connected families could pull strings. The Boones weren't wealthy or connected, but that mysterious cache of gold might have changed things. $8,000 could have bought the best legal defense available in Alabama. It could have bribed witnesses, influenced jury selection, even swayed judges. We'll never know if it would have been enough. The fire that consumed the Boone farmhouse ensured that the brothers faced the ultimate judgment without ever seeing the inside of a courtroom. Some might call that justice. Others might call it a tragedy. Not for the Boones themselves, But for the victims' families who never got their day in court, never got to hear the full truth of what happened and why, the human cost. Let's zoom out for a moment and consider the full scope of human suffering caused by the Boone brothers' actions. 14 men were killed directly, but the ripple effects extended far beyond those immediate deaths. The victims left behind at least 23 children who lost fathers. 9 women were widowed. Dozens of extended family members, siblings, parents, cousins, were left to grieve. The economic impact on these families was catastrophic. In 1884, most families depended entirely on the father's labor for survival. Widows had few options for earning income. Children had to leave school to work. Farms were lost. Families were broken up. One documented case tells of the Garrett family. After William Garrett was killed, his widow Elizabeth tried to maintain their farm with the help of her 4 children, the oldest of whom was just 12 years old. They lasted 8 months before the bank foreclosed. Elizabeth and the children moved to Mobile, where she worked as a laundress and the children worked in factories. 2 of the children died before reaching adulthood, likely from the harsh industrial working conditions. The family was destroyed. Multiply that story by 14, and you begin to understand the true cost of the Alabama bloodbath. And then there's the psychological trauma inflicted on the entire community. For years afterward, people in Sumter County lived in fear. They didn't trust their neighbors. They didn't feel safe in their own homes. Children had nightmares. Adults slept with guns under their pillows. One newspaper account from 1885 described Sumter County as a place where fear has taken root in the very soil. People moved away. Property values declined. The social fabric of the community was torn apart. It took decades for Sumter County to recover, if it ever truly did. Under the Boone family survivors. One aspect of the story that's often overlooked is what happened to the surviving members of the Boone family. William Boone, the patriarch who wasn't involved in the killings, died less than a year after the massacre. Some accounts claim he died of a broken heart, unable to cope with the shame of what his sons had done. Medical records suggest he actually died of a stroke, but the stress and grief certainly could have contributed. The Boone brothers had wives and children. Thomas was married with 2 young sons. Andrew had a wife and infant daughter. Samuel was unmarried but had been courting a local woman. After the massacre, these families were ostracized. Thomas's wife, Mary, tried to continue living on the Boone property, but she was harassed, threatened, and eventually driven out. She moved to Mississippi and changed her name. Her sons grew up not knowing their father's true identity. Andrew's widow, Catherine, suffered a mental breakdown. She was institutionalized in an asylum in Tuscaloosa and died there in 1891, still insisting that her husband had been innocent. The woman Samuel had been courting, whose name is lost to history, broke off the relationship immediately and married someone else within months. According to family lore, she refused to ever speak Samuel's name again for the rest of her life. The Boone name became toxic. Anyone associated with the family changed their surnames or moved far away. By 1900, there were no Boones left in Sumter County. It's a grim reminder that violence doesn't just destroy victims, it destroys perpetrators' families too. Lessons and reflections. So what do we take away from the Alabama bloodbath? What lessons, if any, can we draw from this dark chapter of American history? First, there's the obvious lesson about the dangers of vigilante justice. The Boone brothers decided to take the law into their own hands, to punish Jacob Miller for a crime he may or may not have committed. That decision set in motion a chain of violence that consumed everything in its path. If they'd gone to the authorities, if they'd trusted the legal system, 14 people would still have lived. Second, there's a lesson about the escalation of violence. The Boone's first murder led inevitably to the second and the second to the third, until they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. Violence begets violence. Revenge solves nothing. These are old truths, but the Boone case illustrates them with brutal clarity. Third, there's a lesson about community and social bonds. The Boones were able to commit their crimes in part because the social institutions that should have prevented them, law enforcement, courts, communal oversight, were weak and underfunded. In a stronger, more cohesive society, They might have been stopped sooner. But perhaps the deepest lesson is about the fragility of civilization itself. The Boone brothers weren't evil in some abstract, supernatural sense. They were ordinary men who, under pressure and stress, chose violence. They crossed a line that most of us never cross, but that line is thinner than we like to believe. Any of us, given the wrong circumstances, the wrong influences, the wrong moment of rage, could potentially make similar choices. That's a terrifying thought, but it's also an important one. It reminds us that morality requires constant vigilance, that we must consciously choose to be good, to follow laws, to treat each other with dignity. The Boone brothers chose differently, and 14 people paid the price. Conclusion. The Alabama bloodbath remains one of the most shocking and least-known mass murders in American history. In 3 days of violence in the summer of 1884, 3 brothers killed at least 13 men in a desperate attempt to escape justice for an initial murder. They failed. They died in flames, taking the full truth of their crimes to their graves. The victims, Jacob Miller, his sons James and Robert, his brother Daniel, the 3 men who rode for help, the farmhands, the merchant, the farmer, and Deputy Frank Morrison, deserve to be remembered not just as statistics but as individuals whose lives had value and meaning. Their families, who suffered unimaginable loss and trauma, deserve our recognition and respect. And even the Boone brothers, monsters though they became, deserve to be understood as human beings who made terrible choices, not as caricatures of evil. This story doesn't have a neat ending or a satisfying moral. It's messy and tragic and deeply disturbing. But it's part of our history, and it deserves to be told. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for watching, and I want to remind you one more time to subscribe to this channel. We dig deep into forgotten true crime stories like this one, bringing them out of the shadows and into the light where they belong. Hit that like button if this video made you think. Share it with someone who appreciates true crime history. And leave a comment below. What do you think motivated the Boone brothers? Were they defending themselves or were they simply murderers from the start? I'll see you in the next investigation. Until then, stay curious. And remember, the past is never as far away as we think. The Alabama bloodbath happened. 14 men died, and we owe it to them to never forget.